Hello and welcome to Intervals 101. In this video, you'll learn what intervals are, you'll learn all of the different types of intervals, you'll learn how each type of interval sounds, and at the end, I'll be quizzing your ear to see if you can recognize the intervals. If you're interested in learning more about intervals in music theory, check out my course, Music Theory for Violinists. You'll learn more about scales, chords, and intervals, how to recognize them in music, and how to perform chordal analysis, which can greatly influence your phrasing. Use the code YT for 15% off the course. Intervals are the distance between two notes. When you're counting intervals, you always want to count the note you started on and the note that you ended on. So for example, the interval of a third is 3 notes. For example, A, B, C. It does not mean that you skip 3 notes in between. Learning to recognize intervals is so important for your intonation. Unless you're blessed with perfect pitch, intervals are going to be the main way that you tell if your notes are in tune or not. When you can recognize these intervals, you'll much more easily be able to tell when you're out of tune and what you need to do to fix it, aka move your finger higher or lower. There's 5 qualities of intervals: major intervals, minor intervals, augmented intervals, which means bigger, diminished intervals, which means smaller, and perfect intervals. Now, I know there's a much more sciencey definition to this, and if you know it, definitely let me know, but perfect intervals essentially are when the sound waves of the 2 notes are related to each other by a whole number integer. So for example, 3 to 2. These intervals almost sound like one note when played together. The final piece that you need to understand before we dive into the intervals are whole steps and half steps. So half steps are when your fingers are touching on the violin. And if you were looking at a piano, it would be any 2 keys next to each other, no matter if it was black or white, just any 2 keys that are right next to each other. A whole step is essentially 2 half steps. So on the violin, it's, for example, when you're playing from B to C sharp, where you have space between your fingers. And if you were looking at the piano, you would have 1 key in between. Intervals can also be classified as consonant or dissonant. Consonant means that the notes sound beautiful when played together, and dissonant means they don't. The first type of interval is called a minor second, and it is notes that are 1 half step away from each other. This is just another way of saying half step. Half step and minor second are the same thing. So an example of this would be A to B flat. As you can tell, that is a dissonant interval. The notes do not sound beautiful when played together. The second type of interval is a major second. This is also called a whole step. Whole step and major second are the same thing. You could probably guess that a major second is notes that are 2 half steps away from each other. An example would be A and B natural. This is also a dissonant interval. Now, the way that I personally tell minor seconds from major seconds or half steps from whole steps is that the half steps or the minor seconds sound closer. That the A and the B flat, it's almost sounding like it wants to resolve to unison. It wants to resolve to that one note. Major seconds still sound dissonant, but they sound more like 2 independent notes that are rubbing against each other or competing with each other. The next interval is a minor third, which is made up of 3 half steps. An example of this would be A to C natural. That is a consonant interval. It sounds beautiful when played together. The next interval is a major third. This is 4 half steps. An example of this would be A and C sharp. Again, that sounds very consonant. It sounds very beautiful when played together. The way that you tell a difference between a minor third and a major third is a minor third sounds more sad and a major third sounds more happy. The next interval is a perfect fourth. These notes are 5 half steps away from each other. Remember that perfect intervals almost sound like one note when played together, and therefore these notes must be played in tune, because if they're not, it sounds pretty off. An example of a perfect fourth is A to D. See what I mean? One reason why solo Bach is so hard is because he writes a lot of perfect intervals. He writes a lot of perfect fourths, perfect fifths, perfect octaves, which again need to be in tune or else they just sound off. The next interval is called a tritone. It is an augmented fourth, so a bigger fourth, or a diminished fifth, a diminished fifth, so a smaller fifth. A tritone is essentially 6 half steps. This is also sometimes called the devil's interval because it is very dissonant. And if you know the piece Danse Macabre by Saint-Saëns, the interval at the beginning is a tritone. An example of this would be A to D sharp, which would sound like this. And in fact, that's the exact notes that are at the beginning of Danse Macabre. This, of course, is a dissonant interval. The next interval is a perfect fifth, which is 7 half steps away from one another. Again, this is a perfect interval, so it sounds very harmonious, almost like one note when played together. It is a consonant interval. Our strings are also tuned in fifths, so I feel like this is an easier interval to recognize because of that. Because if you know how your strings sound together, then you know how perfect fifths sound. An example would be A and E. Next up, we have a minor 6, which is 8 half steps. This is a consonant interval like this. Major 6 would be 9 half steps, A to F sharp, which would sound like this. Again, consonant interval sounds beautiful, sounds happier than the minor 6th. Next up, we have a minor 7th, which is 10 half steps. This is a dissonant interval. It's A to G. And then, of course, a major 7th comes next, which is 11 half steps, A to G sharp. Again, how I tell them apart is that major 7 feels like it wants to be an octave, right? It feels like it's begging just to go a half step higher. But then the minor 7, sure, they notes sound dissonant, but they don't quite sound like they want to become one note. And the way you tell the seconds versus the 7s is the seconds are much closer to one another. They're much closer to the same pitch. The 7s are much farther away. And then, of course, finally we have the perfect octave, which would just be A to A. This is perhaps the most easy interval to recognize because they are just the same note, which is great for when you're learning your ear, training your ear, right? But it's also not great because it's very obvious when they're out of tune. So those are your basic kinds of intervals. Now I'm going to play one for you. I'll give you a couple seconds to think about it, and then you have to tell me which one you think it is. For one. Major 6th. Number 2. Perfect 5th. Number 3. Major 3rd. Number 4. Minor 7th, and number 5. chose a tritone. Let me know in the comments how many you got right. If you follow me on Instagram, you see me post fun little quizzes like this where I ask you to name the interval or name the note at the end. And the way you do this is just by learning what these intervals sound like and then listening for them in your own playing. If you have any questions about intervals, let me know in the comments. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.